The deed read 160 acres. The men of Harrow Creek had another name for it. They called it the Anvil. It rose from the eastern edge of the valley like a fist of pale limestone, broad and flat-topped and merciless under the Wyoming sun. Nothing grew on it worth a man's attention. Scrub brush, a few wind-twisted junipers that looked more dead than alive, loose sandstone that crumbled underfoot and coated your boots with rust-colored dust. The Anvil caught the worst of the summer heat and funneled the coldest winter winds straight down into the green pastures below. For as long as anyone in Harrow Creek could remember, it had been considered a geological insult. A place that existed for no good reason. It was now the sole inheritance of Nora Calloway. She was 19 years old. She had been a widow for 1 year, an orphan for 10, and the owner of the most useless piece of rock in Wyoming territory for 2. Her husband, Will, had been a quiet, decent man who worked hard and laughed easily, and the fever that took him in the spring of 1877 had been swift and indifferent. Her parents were older, still lost to a river crossing when she was 9 years old, swept away on a gray April morning while she watched from the bank. It was her grandfather, Edmund, who had pulled her from that riverbank and raised her in his small cabin on the edge of the Anvil's shadow. Edmund Calloway had been an unusual man. He had worked the Pennsylvania coal mines as a young man, learning the language of rock long before he ever thought to study it formally. He had come west with a worn leather satchel full of handwritten notes and a conviction that the land held secrets most men were too impatient to find. He had purchased the Anvil for $40 from a man who thought he was cheating him. Edmund had known better. He spent the last 20 years of his life mapping it, not its surface, but its bones, the layers beneath, the geometry of what lay hidden. He had filled Nora's head with words that other girls her age had never heard. Aquifer, permeability, caprock, saturated zone. He drew cross-sections of the earth in the dirt with a stick, explaining how water moved through stone, the way blood moved through a body, slowly and visibly following paths carved over centuries. He told her that the real water, the water that lasted, was never found in rivers or shallow wells. It was found in rock. When Edmund died in the autumn of 1876, he left Nora the Anvil and a satchel full of journals. For 2 years, she had lived simply tending a small garden on the lower slope of the mesa, trading work with neighboring farms for what she could not grow herself. The townspeople of Harrow Creek regarded her with a mixture of pity and mild bewilderment. She was young. She was alone. She owned a pile of worthless rock. Most assumed she would eventually sell it for whatever she could get and move somewhere more sensible. She had not sold it. And she had read every word of Edmund's journals 3 times over. On the morning of December 12, 1878, the sky above Harrow Creek was the color of bleached bone. The Redemption River, the valley's central artery, had spent the summer retreating from its banks with a quiet urgency that made the older farmers uneasy. The winter snows had been meager, a thin dusting that vanished inside a week. The spring rains had not come. Now the first brutal cold of December settled over the valley, and the river ran shallow and slow, its water the color of weak coffee, carrying more silt than anyone wanted to admit. A meeting was called. The Harrow Creek Town Hall was a long, low building that smelled of pine sap and old wood smoke. By 7 in the evening, it was packed with nearly every adult in the valley. Farmers, ranchers, merchants. Men whose boots carried the good black mud of irrigated fields. Men who had built their lives on the assumption that the water would always be there. Harlan Briggs stood at the front of the room. He was a large man, well past 50, with a face that had been weathered by decades of Wyoming wind into something resembling carved oak. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, over 2,000 head on 1,200 acres of prime bottomland. He had served on the town council for 15 years and had never in any of those years been seriously contradicted. His voice, when he spoke, filled the room without effort. "We all know why we're here," he said. "The river is low. The wells are following it down. We act now, or we spend the spring in real trouble." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "We deepen the town well. Another 20 feet ought to reach the lower table. Every household goes to a bucket a day, for the house half that per head of stock. It's hard, but it's what's been done before, and it's what works." The room received this with the grim, nodding acceptance of people who wanted to believe in a plan. From the back of the hall near the door, Nora Calloway spoke. "It won't be enough." Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Heads turned. She stood straight, her hands at her sides, dressed in the dark wool coat she wore every winter. She was slight, dark-haired, and looked younger than her 19 years to anyone who didn't look at her eyes. "The river isn't just low," she said. "The water table itself is dropping. The shallow aquifers that feed your wells are connected to the river. When the river goes, they go with it. 20 more feet won't find water that isn't there." Harlan Briggs turned his head slowly. A tolerant smile crossed his face. "And what does young Miss Calloway suggest?" "The sandstone layer of the anvil," she said. "My grandfather mapped it for 20 years. It's a deep-water aquifer, porous and saturated, insulated from surface conditions by a layer of shale and caliche. The water up there hasn't moved in centuries. It doesn't care about the drought down here." She kept her voice steady. "I'm proposing a vertical shaft to reach the saturated layer, then a series of sloped horizontal galleries to collect the seepage into a central reservoir. It's an ancient system proven in desert regions going back thousands of years. It would be permanent." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have just heard something they have no framework to understand. Then Clem Alderdice, a broad-shouldered farmer who worked the eastern fields, let out a laugh that broke the tension like a hammer through glass. "She wants to squeeze water out of a rock," he said. Others joined in, tentative at first, then building. Briggs raised a hand, and the laughter settled, though it didn't disappear. "Nora," he said, using her first name with the deliberate ease of a man reminding a child of the hierarchy of things. "Your grandfather was an interesting fellow, but interesting theories don't water cattle. I'll give you $50 for that land. Fair price for a fair piece of rock, and enough for you to get yourself settled somewhere more suitable." "The land isn't for sale," she said, "and neither is the water that's in it." She turned and walked out. Behind her, the room exhaled. Some men shook their heads. Clem Alderdice said something to the man beside him that made them both laugh again. Virgil Tench, a lean and cautious man who served on the council alongside Briggs, watched the door close and said nothing. Briggs watched it too. For a moment, something moved behind his eyes. That wasn't contempt. Then he turned back to the room and continued as if she had never spoken. Outside in the cold December dark, Nora walked the road home with her hands deep in her coat pockets. In her right hand, her fingers closed around a folded piece of paper she had been carrying for 2 years. It was a page torn from the back of one of Edmund's journals, his handwriting cramped and certain. She knew the words by heart, but she held the paper anyway. The shallow wells will fail in the long drought. They always do. The answer is on the anvil. It has always been on the anvil. She walked faster. The next morning, she went to see Briggs. She found him in the yard of his main house watching 2 of his men work on a fence line that had come down in the November wind. He saw her coming and dismissed the men with a glance. "I thought we settled things last night," he said. "I came to tell you directly," she said. "When the town well fails, my system will be the only water in this valley. I wanted you to hear that from me, not as a threat, but as a fact." Briggs studied her for a long moment. The tolerant smile was gone. In its place was something quieter and more calculating. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "I've watched men with good theories go broke out here more times than I can count. I'm trying to save you from that. $50 is a generous offer. Think carefully before you throw it back again." "My grandfather spent 20 years mapping that rock," she said. "He died knowing something you don't. I intend to find out if he was right." She turned and left him standing in his yard. That afternoon, she went to Holt's general store with $47 in silver coins. Mr. Holt was a small, careful man who kept meticulous records and asked few questions. She bought a dozen steel drill bits, 100 feet of thick hemp rope, 2 oak buckets, and a block and tackle. The purchase came to $27. She walked out with $20 remaining and the understanding that it had to last her as long as the work took. She spent the next 3 days on the anvil with Edmund's maps unrolled across a flat section of limestone, weighted at the corners with stones. The maps were extraordinary documents, not sketches of the surface, but layered cross-sections drawn with a surveyor's precision. Edmund had marked everything: the caliche cap and its average thickness of 12 feet, the shale layer beneath it gray and impervious, and below that the Redemption sandstone, as he had named it, 80 feet thick and saturated with water, held in the spaces between grains patient and invisible and real. She used a plumb line and a long wooden trough filled with creek water as a spirit level, walking the plateau in a methodical grid, checking Edmund's triangulation points, each one marked by a cairn of stacked stones he had placed years before. She was looking for the optimal location, the spot where the sandstone was thickest and closest to the surface, where the overlying shale and caliche were thinnest. On the afternoon of the second day, she found the 4th cairn. Beneath it, wedged into a crevice in the rock, was something she had not expected: a small roll of cured deer hide, dried hard and tied with a strip of rawhide. She crouched in the wind and unwrapped it with careful fingers. Inside was a strip of leather, no larger than her palm. Edmund's handwriting, small and deliberate, pressed deep into the leather with an awl. "If you find this, the drought has come. Don't wait for them to believe you. Just dig. The water is waiting. It has always been waiting." She sat with it in her hands for a long time, the wind moving across the mesa. The valley spread below her in the pale December light. Edmund had known. He had mapped this place, calculated the drought cycle, placed this message for her like a letter posted years in advance. He had died knowing she might need it. She was not alone on this mesa. She was completing something he had started. She marked her dig site with a circle of white stones, precisely 4 feet across, at the point where Edmund's calculations converged. She would begin in the morning. December 19th, 1878. Nora Calloway drove the blade of her pickaxe into the ground at the center of the white stone circle and began. The first 5 feet were compacted clay and caliche, brutally hard but workable. She swung the pickaxe in a steady rhythm, levered chunks loose with the iron bar, loaded them into a bucket, and hoisted them to the surface with the block and tackle rigged between 2 juniper posts she had sunk on either side of the shaft. The system was simple and effective. Dig, fill, hoist, lower the empty bucket, dig again. Her hands blistered by noon of the first day. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working. By the end of the day, she was 3 feet down. By the end of the second day, 5. She ate her meals at the edge of the shaft, sitting with her legs dangling into the hole, too tired to walk to her small camp 20 yards away. She slept hard and dreamlessly, and woke before first light and went back to work. The caliche gave way to harder caprock by the end of the first week. Now the pickaxe rang against stone with a jarring impact that traveled all the way to her shoulder blades. She began using the sledgehammer and iron wedges, driving the wedges into natural seams in the rock, then striking them in sequence until a slab fractured and dropped. The progress slowed. 6 inches, 4 inches, 8 inches on a good day. Below in the valley, the work of deepening the town well had begun. She could sometimes hear faintly the sound of tools against stone drifting up from the direction of town. She did not go down to watch. She had no time and no interest. Her world had contracted to the 4-foot circle of limestone beneath her feet. At the end of 2 weeks, she was 12 feet deep. On the morning she reached 12 feet, her pickaxe struck a different kind of resistance. The sharp ringing of caprock gave way to a duller, flaking sound like breaking slate. She cleared away the loose rock and held her lantern close to the exposed surface. Gray, greasy, dense. Her heart kicked against her ribs. The shale layer, Edmund's final barrier. According to his notes, it averaged 14 feet in thickness here, dense and impermeable, the lid on everything below. She traced her fingers across its surface. It was cold and faintly damp, which meant the sandstone below was doing exactly what Edmund said it would do, pressing its moisture upward against the cap. She had been right to come here. She sat at the bottom of her shaft in the lantern light 12 feet below the surface of the anvil and let herself feel it. Not triumph, not yet, but the first solid, grounded certainty she had felt since Edmund's death. The theory was real. The water was real. She only had to reach it. She was still sitting there when the church bell in the valley below began to ring. It was not the regular hour. She counted the strokes. 7 slow, irregular tolls with pauses between them. A signal, not a time. She climbed her ladder and stood on the rim of the shaft and looked down into the valley. On the road that ran east from town, a wagon was moving. loaded high with furniture and bundled goods, a milk cow tied to the tailgate, two children visible on the seat beside their parents. Even from this distance, she recognized the broad bay horse pulling the wagon. It belonged to Clem Alderdice. The man who had laughed loudest in the town hall was the first one running. Nora watched the wagon until it rounded the curve of the eastern road and disappeared into the pale hills. Then she turned back to her shaft, picked up her hammer, and went back down into the dark. The shale fought back. Where the caprock had broken in chunks and slabs, the shale came away in flat, greasy flakes, the size of a man's hand coated with a gray powder that settled on everything. On Nora's skin, in her hair, in the creases of her knuckles, and the corners of her eyes. She tasted it constantly, a mineral bitterness at the back of her throat. The lantern light caught the dust in the air and turned the shaft into a dim grayish haze that burned her eyes by midday. The shale demanded patience she had to manufacture from nothing. She could not use the wedge and slab method here. The rock had no useful fracture lines, no seams to exploit. She had to work the surface methodically, using the pointed end of the smaller pickaxe to chip away at it, inch by inch, the way a sculptor removes unwanted stone, except that her sculpture was a void, a hole in the earth, and every chip of it had to be loaded into a bucket and hauled 40 feet to the surface. She developed a rhythm. 15 minutes of chipping. Fill the bucket. Hoist. Lower. 15 minutes more. She counted her strokes against the rock the way some people counted prayers. Her progress dropped to a foot a day, sometimes less. Down in the valley, the situation was worsening in ways she could track by sound and observation from her elevated position. The low, continuous lowing of thirsty cattle, the occasional crack of a rifle mercy shots for animals too far gone to recover. Twice more she saw wagons on the eastern road loaded with the movable pieces of abandoned lives. Each time she watched until they were gone. Each time she went back to her shaft. On the 38th day of digging, January 26, 1879, she was 16 feet deep and 4 feet into the shale when it happened. She had been working the left wall of the shaft, extending her chip pattern across the face, when a section of shale that had appeared solid let go without warning. A slab roughly 2 feet across and a foot thick separated from the wall and struck her left shoulder with the full weight of falling stone. The pain was immediate and white and total. She dropped the pickaxe and pressed herself against the opposite wall. Her right hand clamped over her left shoulder, breathing in sharp, controlled pulls. Not broken. She could move the arm. But the muscle had been compressed hard against the bone. And when she tried to raise her elbow above her waist, the pain bloomed outward through her chest and neck with a force that made her vision go briefly white. She climbed out of the shaft one-handed. She sat on the cold limestone of the mesa top and pressed her back against the juniper post of her hoisting rig and waited for the worst of the pain to pass. It did not entirely pass. She wrapped her shoulder tightly with the length of flannel she used as a work rag, packed the joint with a handful of clean snow she scraped from a sheltered hollow in the rock, and walked to her small tent. She lay still for the rest of that day and all of the next. On the second evening of her forced rest, the wind came from the south, and with it came sounds from the valley below, carried upward with unusual clarity. a child crying with the particular thin, exhausted cry of thirst, not hunger. A man's voice, low and ragged, talking to an animal. The sound of wagon wheels on frozen mud. And underneath it all, a silence where the river used to be a silence that had a texture to it, a density, the absence of something that had always been present and was now simply gone. The Harrow Creek River had stopped running. Nora lay in her tent with her damaged shoulder pressed against the rolled canvas of her bedroll and listened to a valley dying by degrees. She thought about Edmund, about the 20 years he had spent on this mesa, mapping what no one else thought was worth mapping. She thought about Will, about his quiet hands, and the particular way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him. She thought about the family whose wagon she had watched leave the children on the seat, and where they would end up, and whether there was anything better waiting for them, or just a different kind of hard. She cried silently, and without drama, the way a person cries when they are completely alone and have no audience to perform for. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. On the morning of the third day, her shoulder had settled into a deep, manageable ache. She rewrapped it, pulled her coat on carefully, and went back down into the shaft. The work resumed. She developed a compensating method, using her right arm for the heavy strikes, and her left only for the lighter chipping and clearing work. It was slower. It was enough. The shale continued to come away in its thin, grudging flakes, and the shaft deepened by its small daily increments, and the pile of excavated rock on the mesa surface grew into a low gray hill. On the morning of January 12, 1879, Nora was 17 feet below the surface of the anvil. She placed the point of her pickaxe against the floor of the shaft, drew back, and drove it down with both arms. The impact was different. Not the flat, dense resistance of shale. Something softer. The pickaxe point sank in 1.5 inches and stopped. And when she pulled it free, there was a sound. A soft exhalation like a sleeping thing startled awake, and then a smell rose up from the small hole she had made. It was the smell of deep earth and cold water. Clean, ancient, real. She set the pickaxe aside and knelt and pressed her palm flat against the floor of the shaft. Through the broken shale and the surface of what lay beneath, she could feel it. Not water flowing, not a spring, something more subtle. The faint, steady pressure of moisture held in stone. The sandstone pressing its water up against the broken cap, the way a saturated sponge releases its water when you puncture the outer layer. She had reached it. The physical relief was so complete it felt almost like falling. She leaned her back against the shaft wall and pressed her dusty, bandaged hands flat against her thighs and breathed. The lantern flame burned steadily in the still air below the shale cap. She could hear nothing from above. The valley, the wind, the dying cattle, all of it was gone. There was only the cold, the dark, and the faint, persistent smell of water that had been waiting in this rock since before anyone alive had been born. She thought of Edmund. She said his name out loud once quietly into the shaft. Then she picked up the pickaxe and began the real work. The sandstone was different. Where the shale had been dense and resistant, the sandstone was coarse and yielding almost cooperative under the chisel and spade. Its surface glistened in the lantern light. When she laid her palm against the freshly exposed face, her hand came away wet. Not dripping. Wet. the moisture held in the grain of the rock releasing itself gradually into the air and downward along the walls. Edmund's plan called for a central chamber first, 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, 7 feet high, carved horizontally from the base of the shaft, with 4 galleries radiating outward from it, like the spokes of a wheel, each one 50 feet long and 5 feet high. The design maximized the surface area of exposed water-bearing stone. Every square foot of gallery wall and ceiling would seep. The combined seepage from the entire system would collect on the gently sloped chamber floor and drain into a central reservoir pit. She began the chamber. It was slow, meticulous work that demanded a kind of sustained, deliberate attention, different from the brutal rhythm of the shaft. She marked her cuts with chalk lines. She worked in sections, always leaving thick pillars of sandstone at regular intervals to support the ceiling above. She checked the level of the floor constantly, using a small wooden trough of water to verify the 2-degree slope that Edmund's plans specified the angle precise enough to direct every trickle toward the center without causing erosion. The sandstone came away in slabs that were heavy but manageable. She broke them into pieces she could lift, loaded the buckets, and hoisted them up. Ton by ton, bucket by bucket, the chamber opened itself from the living rock. By the middle of March, the walls were weeping visibly, not dripping, not flowing, but seeping, tiny beads of water forming on the exposed sandstone face, coalescing, running together in thin threads that followed the 2-degree slope of the floor toward the center. She dug the central reservoir pit 5 feet deep and 10 feet wide and watched it slowly fill. The first time she cupped a handful of that water and drank it, she stood still for a long time afterward. It was cold. It had no taste at all, which meant it was cleaner than anything she had ever drunk from a surface source. It tasted like stone and time and depth. Down in the valley in that same month of March, the town well finally gave out. The council had deepened it by 30 feet at considerable expense and collective effort, and it had produced water for 6 weeks longer than it otherwise would have. And then it had stopped. The men who came up from the shaft reported dry gravel and a faint smell of minerals. Nothing else. Briggs sent for a drilling crew from Cheyenne. They arrived with equipment that cost more money than most of the valley's farmers had seen in a year. They worked for 3 weeks and drove their drill down 100 feet before it struck a shelf of granite that would not yield. The equipment came up dry, and the drilling crew left with their payment, and Briggs stood in his yard and watched them go. His cattle were dying, not quickly, not mercifully, but one by one over weeks as their bodies used the last of their moisture and gave out. He had sold off 400 head in February to buyers from farther north, accepting prices so low it amounted to giving them away. The pastures that had been green the previous summer were gray-brown dust cracked in geometric patterns like old pottery. In April, Briggs rode up to the anvil. He brought Alderdice and Tench with him, riding slowly because the horses were weakened by the same drought. They found Nora hauling a bucket of sandstone rubble up from the shaft with her block, and Tackle her arms working the rope in the steady, economical pull of someone who had done it thousands of times. She set the bucket down and watched them come. Alderdice looked at the shaft, at the pile of excavated stone that now rose nearly 4 feet off the mesa surface at the small stone house Nora had built over the shaft entrance to keep the evaporation down and the animals out. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Whatever comment he had come prepared to make seemed to have left him. Briggs reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper. "I had a lawyer look at your deed," he said. His voice was flat without inflection. "Edmund's deed. I was looking for problems with it." Nora said nothing. "There aren't any." He folded the paper and put it back. "The deed is solid. The land is yours." He looked at the stone house, at the barrel of water sitting beside the shaft entrance in the thin April sunlight. The water in it was clear enough that the grain of the wood was visible through it. He stepped forward, lifted the ladle that hung on the barrel's rim, and scooped it full. He drank. He set the ladle back without expression. His jaw moved once as he swallowed. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the trail. Olderdice and Tench following without a word spoken between any of them. Nora watched them go. Then she picked up the rope and went back to work. April became May. May became June. She finished the chamber. She began the 4 radiating galleries, each one a narrow passage carved into the living sandstone, 2 feet wide and 5 feet high, advancing in the darkness by lantern light, and the sound of her own breathing, and the steady rhythmic drip of water finding its way out of the stone around her. She left stone pillars every 8 feet. She checked her slopes constantly. She sealed the collection channels along the gallery floors with flat stones and pressed clay into the joints the way Edmund's notes describe creating a surface smooth enough to carry every drop without loss. The work in the galleries was the most solitary thing she had ever done. The passages were too narrow to turn around in. She had to work forward and then back herself out, moving in the dark with the lantern held ahead of her. The ceiling close above her head. The walls close on either side. There were hours in those passages when the only sounds in the world were the chip of her tools and the faint, constant voice of water giving itself up from the stone. She did not find those hours frightening. She found them clarifying. The rock asked nothing of her except attention and patience. It did not judge or doubt or mock. It simply held its water, and when asked correctly, released it. Edmund had understood this. She understood it now in a way that could not have been learned from his journals alone. By the 1st of June, 1879, all 4 galleries were complete, 50 feet each. 200 feet of water-bearing sandstone surface in the galleries alone, plus the chamber walls, plus the ceiling. In total, over 2,000 square feet of exposed aquifer. The central reservoir held 4,000 gallons of clear, cold water. The measured collection rate was 100 gallons per day, steady and reliable, independent of surface conditions, indifferent to drought. She built the capstone structure over the shaft entrance with the excavated rock she had piled on the mesa surface. A small circular stone building 10 feet across with thick walls and a heavy wooden door fitted with a wooden latch. From the outside, it looked like a shepherd's hut or a small storage house. There was nothing about it that advertised what lay beneath. She sat outside the door on the evening she finished it, watching the last light leave the valley below. The valley was gray and brown and still. No cattle sounds, no children calling. The road through town was empty in both directions. Harrow Creek looked from this height like a place already abandoned, still standing, but no longer quite alive. She had spent $42 of her $47 on this project. She had $5 left. It had taken her 6 months. Inside the stone house behind her, the shaft dropped 17 feet into the earth, and at the bottom of it lay a cathedral of water she had carved with her own 2 hands, and it was filling slowly and steadily, 100 gallons per day, and it would keep filling whether anyone came for it or not. The morning of June 15th, 1879, broke clear and windless, the sky a hard, depthless blue that offered no comfort. The valley of Harrow Creek lay in the early light, the color of old bone, its fields cracked and gray, its river reduced to a dark stain of mud at the bottom of a wide empty channel. The communal pasture was a dust bowl. The gardens were gone. The sound of cattle was gone. Even the birds seemed to have found somewhere better to be. In the town, the situation had moved past crisis into something quieter and more final. The last of the communal water stores, barrels filled weeks ago from the final trickle of the river, had been consumed 4 days before. The town well was dry stone. 2 more families had packed and left in the night, their houses standing open. The remaining families rationed what could be found in shallow pans and rain barrels. It was not enough, and everyone knew it. Harlan Briggs had aged visibly since April. The broad, settled authority that had made him the largest presence in every room he entered had diminished into something harder and quieter. The look of a man who has been proven wrong by facts too large to argue with. His cattle operation was effectively gone. The herd he had spent 30 years building had been sold, died, or scattered. The green bottomland he owned was cracked gray desert. He had drilled his 100 feet and found granite. He had deepened his private well to the limit of what was possible and watched it go dry anyway. There was nowhere left to look except up. He came to the decision alone in the early morning, sitting on the porch of his main house in the dark. When the light came, he walked into town and knocked on doors. Not asking, telling. There was no room left for anything but directness. By 8 in the morning, 31 people had assembled on the road at the edge of town, facing east toward the anvil. Men, women, 7 children. Most of them carrying empty buckets or canteens. They looked at the pale limestone mesa against the morning sky, and then at one another. No one said much. Briggs stood at the front. He had come on foot because his horse was too weak to carry him. He held his hat in both hands. He began walking, and the others followed. The trail up to the anvil was not long, but it was steep, and the people climbing it were weakened by weeks of insufficient water. They went slowly, helping the children over the difficult sections, pausing at the switchback halfway up to let people catch their breath. The sound of their passage boots on limestone, the occasional clink of a tin canteen against a bucket handle rose into the still morning air, and then was absorbed by the rock. Nora heard them coming. She was inside the stone house, checking the seals on the gallery drainage channels by feel and lantern light, a task she had taken to doing each morning as a kind of discipline, a way of maintaining what she had built rather than simply resting on it. When she heard the sound of footsteps on the trail, she extinguished the lantern and climbed the shaft ladder and stood in the dim interior of the stone house for a moment, listening. Then she opened the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the morning light. They were coming over the last rise of the trail. Briggs at their head, the others spread out behind him across the width of the rocky path. She watched them come and did not move from where she stood. The morning light fell on their faces from the east. She could read what she needed from that distance. Briggs stopped 10 feet from her. He was a large man made smaller by what the last months had done to him. The flesh had come off his face in the way it does from men who have been under sustained stress, leaving the bone more visible, the jaw sharper, the eyes deeper in their sockets. He held his hat against his chest with both hands. He looked at the ground between them for a moment. Then he looked at her, looked at Miss Calloway, he said. His voice had gone rough at the edges the way voices do when a man has been using them for things they were not built for. We were wrong. The words came out with the careful, measured weight of something that had cost him a great deal to bring to the surface. The wells are gone. The river is gone. We are out of options and we are out of time. He paused. The children haven't had clean water in 4 days. Behind him, the valley stretched away, gray and cracked and immense. The people standing on the trail looked at her with the particular expression that appears on the faces of the proud when pride has finally been starved out of them by necessity. Clem Alderdice, who had laughed loudest of anyone in the town hall 6 months ago, stood near the back of the group, with his eyes fixed on a point somewhere to the left of Nora's shoulder. Nora looked at the children. There were 7 of them. The youngest was perhaps 3 years old, held against a woman's chest. Their faces were pale and dry in the way that faces become when the body has begun rationing its internal water. She looked at Briggs. "I know," she said. "Come with me." She turned and opened the door of the stone house and stepped inside. One by one, they followed her in, ducking through the low doorway, crowding into the small circular space, and looking down at the dark opening of the shaft and the ladder descending into it. A wave of cool, damp air rose from below, carrying that unmistakable smell, clean stone and deep water, and the darkness below the reach of drought. "One at a time," she said. "The ladder is strong." She went first. Briggs came down behind her. His boots touched the chamber floor and he straightened and stood still, waiting for his eyes to find their way in the lantern light Nora had relit. She watched his face as the space assembled itself for him, the carved walls glistening and close, the 4 gallery openings, dark passages disappearing into the earth. The sound which was the sound of water, a soft and constant dripping and seeping from 4 directions at once, like rain that existed only underground, patient and unhurried and continuous, and in the center of the chamber the reservoir, 4,000 gallons of water so clear that the lantern light passed through it and illuminated the stone bottom, carved and smoothed and angled, to collect every drop that the rock above it was willing to give. Briggs stood at the edge of it. He did not speak. His chest rose and fell. Something was happening on his face that had nothing to do with the calculations and assessments that usually occupied it. The others came down one by one, and as each one reached the floor of the chamber and took in what was before them, the sound they made was not a cheer or a shout. It was something quieter and more fundamental, an exhale, a release. The sound of people who had stopped believing something was possible discovering that it is. A woman knelt at the edge of the reservoir and brought water to her lips with cupped hands and bent her head over the pool and wept. The children were brought forward and helped to drink. When it had been quiet for a while, when the first desperate thirst had been met, and people were simply standing in the cool chamber looking at the walls and the galleries and the carved geometry of what had been accomplished here. Briggs turned to Nora. "How many feet did you move alone?" he asked. His voice was low with none of its old performance in it. "Every foot," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "In April," he said slowly. "I rode up here with a lawyer's letter in my pocket. I was looking for a way to take this from you." He held her gaze steadily as he said it. "I found the water in that ladle you held out. I knew it was real. I knew it that day. And I rode back down anyway." He paused. "I want you to know, I understand the difference between being wrong about the water and being wrong about that." The chamber was very quiet. The dripping continued from the four galleries, even and unhurried. Nora was still for a moment. Then she spoke. "The water is not for sale," she said. "Not to you or anyone else. But here are the terms under which I'll share it." She looked at the people standing in the lantern light around the reservoir. "Distribution is based on need, not acreage, not wealth, not whose name is on more deeds. A council will be formed to manage it, and I will lead it because I built it, and I understand it." She paused. "Every able man in this valley will learn to read a geological map. They will learn the names and properties of the layers under their feet. They will learn to maintain this system and every system like it." She looked at Briggs directly. "My grandfather's knowledge nearly died with him because no one here thought it was worth learning. That will not happen again." No one spoke. No one argued. Briggs nodded once. Then he said, "I have 40 acres of lower bottomland that can hold a distribution cistern. I'll give it over for common use." He paused. "And I'll dig the first channel myself. You tell me where to put the blade, and I'll put it there." They came back up into the sunlight. The work of building a pipeline began that afternoon. Briggs had said he would dig the first channel, and he did. Nora marked the line in the limestone with a chalk string, and the largest and most powerful man in Harrow Creek took a mattock and drove its blade into the stone at the point she indicated, and began. He was not alone for long. Within the hour, every man on the mesa was working beside him. The pipeline took 3 weeks to complete. Hollowed pine logs sealed with pitch, laid in a shallow trench cut from the anvil's edge, down to a stone cistern on Briggs's donated bottomland. A simple system gravity-fed, requiring nothing more than maintenance and attention to keep it running. On the day the first water ran through it, down the mountain and into the cistern below, a small crowd had gathered at both ends. Nora stood at the top at the valve she had fashioned from a fitted stone plug in the pipeline's first joint. When she pulled the plug, the water started, slowly at first, and then with a steady, quiet confidence. At the cistern below, the water arrived in a thin, continuous stream that widened as the pipe primed itself. The people watching it were very still. One man took off his hat. The drought lasted through the following spring. There was no rain of consequence until April of 1880. During those 10 months, the water from the anvil sustained every remaining family in Harrow Creek. The rationing system Nora designed kept the reservoir from ever dropping below half capacity. She published the collection rate and the consumption figures at the council meetings she ran each Sunday, standing at the shaft entrance with Edmund's maps spread across the capstone, teaching the geology to anyone who would listen. Most of them listened. Clem Alderdice, who had been the first to laugh and the first to run, came back to the valley in the autumn of 1879, having found nothing better elsewhere. He attended every one of her Sunday sessions without ever saying much. He learned to read a cross-section map. He became in time the most diligent maintenance worker the system had. There was no ceremony when the drought finally broke. The rain came on a gray April morning, soft and steady, soaking into the cracked earth, with a patience that mirrored the patience with which the anvil had always held its water. People came to their doors and stood in it. Some of them lifted their faces. Nora stood on the mesa in the rain and felt it on her closed eyelids and her upturned palms. The reservoir below her feet was full. The pipeline was running. The valley was still here. She had not made the rain come. She had made the rain unnecessary. Harlan Briggs came up to the anvil one last time that spring alone on foot, climbing the trail in the steady April drizzle. He found Nora checking the capstone seals crouched beside the stone house, with a trowel and a tin of clay. He stood behind her for a moment before she heard him. When she looked up, he held out his hand. She took it. No speeches. No accounting. Two people who had stood on opposite sides of a very hard thing and survived it, standing in the rain on top of a mesa that had once been worthless, shaking hands over a hole in the ground that had kept an entire valley alive. That was enough. The people of Harrow Creek did not give Nora Calloway a title or a ceremony. What they gave her was harder to counterfeit and longer lasting. They gave her their attention. When she spoke at the Sunday meetings, they were quiet. When she made a decision for the council, they trusted it. When strangers passed through the valley and asked about the water, the people of Harrow Creek told them about the girl on the anvil, about the 20 years of journals and the 6 months alone in the dark, and the system that had outlasted the worst drought in the territory's memory. They called her the keeper of the anvil, not because anyone decided to, not because it was written anywhere or declared at any meeting, simply because it was true. She had gone into the dark with $47 in 2 good hands and an old man's faith, and she had come back with water. In a dry land, there is no greater thing a person can do. The anvil, that broad, pale, useless rock that had been the subject of pitying jokes for as long as anyone could remember, became the most valuable piece of land in Wyoming territory. And in the cool, dripping silence of the chambers she had carved beneath it, the water kept coming. 100 gallons a day. Patient and steady and entirely indifferent to what the men above had believed about it. Edmund had known, and now so did everyone else.